John Harper had always been a man who valued peace and simplicity. He wasn't the type to seek attention or get involved in drama. Instead, he preferred the quiet life his suburban home offered. Nestled at the edge of a small homeowners association, HOA, community, John's house was surrounded by neatly trimmed lawns and identical houses painted in neutral tones. But what set his property apart was the sprawling backyard that stretched far beyond the typical fenced-in lot. This extra space, which John lovingly called the field, was his pride and joy. The field wasn't just an empty patch of dirt. It was alive with color and possibility. In spring, wildflowers bloomed in vibrant shades of yellow, purple, and red, swaying gently in the breeze like nature's own painting. During summer evenings, John would invite friends over for bonfires under the stars, sharing laughter and stories as the crackling flames lit up their faces. It was more than just land. It was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the monotony of everyday life and reconnect with something raw and real. Despite living within the confines of an HOA community, John tried his best to stay out of trouble. He paid his dues on time, followed the rules about trash cans being stored properly, and kept his lawn tidy enough to avoid complaints from nosy neighbors. His interactions with the HOA board were minimal because, honestly, he didn't see much point in getting involved. Those meetings always seemed full of unnecessary arguments over things like mailbox colors or holiday decorations. To John, none of it mattered compared to the beauty of his untouched field. But while John focused on enjoying his little slice of paradise, tensions were simmering beneath the surface of the otherwise calm neighborhood. The HOA board had grown increasingly frustrated with one persistent issue: parking. As more families moved into the development, the number of cars began to outnumber available spaces. Visitors parked along narrow streets, blocking driveways and causing headaches for residents trying to leave their homes. Some even complained about damage to their lawns when guests parked too close to the curb. Margaret, the no-nonsense president of the HOA, had made solving this problem her top priority. She spent countless hours brainstorming solutions, but nothing seemed feasible without significant cost or inconvenience. Then someone suggested repurposing unused areas of the community, like open fields, for additional parking. At first, Margaret hesitated. Taking private property felt extreme, but desperation pushed her forward. And when she looked at John's sprawling backyard, she convinced herself it was the perfect solution. After all, how often did he really use it? Surely, sacrificing a bit of greenery for the greater good wouldn't hurt anyone. What Margaret failed to consider, however, was how deeply John cared about that piece of land. For him, it represented freedom, a rare break from the rigid structure of suburban living. Little did she know, her decision to target his field would spark a chain reaction neither side could have anticipated. While John remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing behind closed doors, his peaceful existence was about to be shattered in ways he couldn't imagine. It was a crisp Saturday morning when John's quiet routine came to an abrupt, enduring halt. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting golden light over his field as he stepped out onto the porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. The air smelled fresh, carrying the faint scent of wildflowers that grew freely across his land. For a moment, everything seemed perfect, until the distant rumble of machinery shattered the tranquility. At first, John thought it might be construction noise coming from somewhere else in the neighborhood. But as the sound grew louder, curiosity got the better of him. Setting his coffee down, he walked toward the edge of his property. What he saw next made his blood run cold. A crew of workers was busy painting bright white lines across his beloved field, dividing it into neat rows of parking spaces. Cars were already pulling in, their drivers chatting casually as if they belonged there. John's heart sank. His sanctuary, the one place he cherished above all others, was being transformed into something unrecognizable right before his eyes. Shock quickly turned to anger as he marched over to confront the workers. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp with disbelief. The men paused briefly, but didn't seem fazed by his outrage. One of them shrugged and replied, "We're just following orders. The HOA hired us." "The HOA," John repeated, incredulous. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could they do this without even asking him? Without waiting for further explanation, he pulled out his phone and dialed Margaret, the HOA president. Her calm, dismissive tone only fueled his frustration. "It's for the good of the community," she said matter-of-factly. "You weren't using it anyway." Those words hit John like a punch to the gut. Not using it. How dare she dismiss years of care and meaning he poured into that space? To her, it might have been nothing more than an empty lot, but to him, it was everything. It was where he went to clear his head after long days at work, where he hosted gatherings with friends, where he felt most alive. And now, thanks to some arbitrary decision made behind closed doors, it was gone. As the day wore on, John watched helplessly as more cars rolled in, their tires crushing the delicate wildflowers he'd nurtured so lovingly. Neighbors who had once barely acknowledged him now strolled through his field as though it belonged to them. Some even nodded politely or waved, completely oblivious to the betrayal etched on his face. Each passing minute felt like a personal affront, a reminder that his voice hadn't mattered in the grand scheme of things. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, John stood alone in what used to be his sanctuary. The vibrant colors of nature had been replaced by stark white lines and rows of parked cars. The laughter and chatter of visitors echoed around him, but it only deepened his sense of isolation. This wasn't just about losing a piece of land. It was about losing control over something he held dear. For the first time in years, John felt truly powerless. But as he stared at the destruction before him, a spark of defiance began to ignite within him. If no one else would listen, then he would find a way to make them hear. Whatever it took, he vowed silently, he wouldn't let this injustice go unanswered. The days following the invasion of his field were a blur of frustration and helplessness for John. He couldn't sleep, tossing and turning as he replayed the scene in his mind. The workers painting lines, the cars rolling in, Margaret's dismissive tone on the phone. Every time he looked out at what used to be his sanctuary, now marred by white stripes and parked vehicles, his chest tightened with anger. But instead of letting his emotions consume him completely, John decided to take action. Surely there had to be a way to fix this. His first step was filing a formal complaint with the HOA. He drafted a letter outlining how they had violated his property rights and sent copies to every board member. He made sure to include photos of the damage, crushed wildflowers, tire tracks marring the soil, and emphasized that no one had sought his permission before taking over his land. To his surprise, the response he received was lukewarm at best. A generic email thanked him for bringing the matter to their attention, but offered no concrete solution or apology. Instead, they reiterated Margaret's earlier justification. It's for the greater good of the community. Unwilling to give up, John decided to attend the next HOA meeting. It wasn't something he enjoyed doing. He found these gatherings tedious and overly dramatic, but desperation drove him to speak up. When the night of the meeting arrived, he walked into the cramped clubhouse feeling out of place among the neatly dressed homeowners sipping coffee and chatting about trivial matters. As the discussion turned to parking issues, John raised his hand hesitantly. "I'd like to address the situation with my field," he began, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. For several minutes, he explained why the decision to use his property without consent was wrong. He suggested alternative solutions, like organizing carpool programs or petitioning the city for additional street parking permits. His proposals were met with awkward silence. Some board members exchanged skeptical glances, while others outright dismissed his ideas. One neighbor even muttered under her breath, loud enough for him to hear, "Why does he care so much? It's just grass." That comment stung more than John expected. Was it really so hard for people to understand? This wasn't just grass to him. It was a part of who he was. The lack of empathy from those around him only solidified his resolve. If reasonable arguments wouldn't work, maybe exposing their hypocrisy would. Things escalated further when John discovered comments about him online. Someone had posted about the conflict in a local Facebook group, framing him as selfish and unreasonable for refusing to share his unused land. Dozens of replies piled up, some defending him but many others mocking him. Entitled jerk, one person wrote. If you're not using it, let others benefit, said another. Reading through the thread left John seething. How could they twist the story like this? Didn't anyone see how unfair it was? Amidst all this chaos, Margaret announced plans for yet another HOA meeting, a special session to discuss ongoing community improvements. She mentioned it casually during a phone call, clearly expecting John to comply after their previous conversations. What she didn't realize, however, was that this announcement gave John an idea. The clubhouse where the meetings took place relied on an underground electrical line that ran directly beneath his property. Without that connection, the building would lose power entirely. For days, John wrestled with the morality of what he was considering. Cutting off the electricity mid-meeting wasn't exactly a conventional move, and he knew it might make him look unreasonable to some. But he also knew that drastic times called for drastic measures. After everything he'd tried, letters, suggestions, pleas for understanding, no one had listened. Maybe, just maybe, flipping the switch would finally get their attention. As the date of the meeting approached, John felt a strange mix of nerves and determination. He knew what he was about to do would shake things up, but he didn't care anymore. Enough was enough. If the HOA wanted to play dirty, then he'd show them what it felt like to have their comfort disrupted. Little did they know, their carefully planned meeting was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would leave everyone talking for weeks to come. The evening of the HOA meeting arrived, and John stood in the shadows near his utility shed, watching as the clubhouse lights flickered on. The small building was already filling up with board members and curious neighbors, all eager to hear updates about the latest community improvements. Margaret could be seen through the window, arranging papers at the head of the table, her usual air of authority radiating even from a distance. Inside, the hum of conversation buzzed, people chatting casually about parking solutions, upcoming events, and whose turn it was to bring snacks next week. Meanwhile, John's hands trembled slightly as he tightened his grip on the toolbox he'd brought with him. He knew what he was about to do wasn't going to win him any popularity contests, but that didn't matter anymore. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about making them feel even a fraction of the frustration he'd endured since they painted over his field. If nothing else, cutting the power would force them to stop ignoring him. Taking a deep breath, John crouched down beside the electrical panel tucked away in his shed. His heart pounded as he traced the wires with his fingers until he found the one connected to the clubhouse. With deliberate movements, he unscrewed the cover and carefully disconnected the line. For a moment, everything seemed eerily quiet. Then, suddenly, the lights in the clubhouse went dark. Inside, chaos erupted almost instantly. People gasped and shouted, scrambling for their phones to use as flashlights. Chairs scraped against the floor as attendees stumbled around, trying to figure out what had happened. Someone banged on the walls, thinking maybe a circuit breaker had tripped. Others groaned loudly, complaining about how inconvenient this was. Margaret, who had been mid-sentence when the lights cut out, let out an audible sigh of exasperation before snapping orders at anyone nearby. "Find someone to fix this," she barked, her voice sharp with irritation. Outside, John leaned against the fence, arms crossed, watching the scene unfold with a mix of satisfaction and disbelief. He couldn't help but chuckle softly as he saw silhouettes moving frantically inside the dimly lit room. It was surreal. Just days ago, these same people had dismissed his concerns without a second thought. Now, here they were, completely thrown off by something as simple as losing power. Karma really did have a sense of humor. It didn't take long for Margaret to storm outside, her face flushed with anger. She scanned the area until her eyes landed on John standing calmly by his property line. Her expression shifted from confusion to fury in an instant. "What did you do?" she demanded, marching toward him with purpose. John straightened up, meeting her gaze without flinching. Funny how quickly things change when you're inconvenienced, he replied coolly, letting his words hang in the air between them. For a moment, Margaret looked like she might explode. But instead of yelling, she took a step closer, lowering her voice in an attempt to regain control of the situation. This isn't funny, John. You can't just sabotage community property whenever you don't get your way. Sabotage? John shot back, raising an eyebrow. You mean like painting parking lines on my private land without asking? Or telling me I'm selfish for wanting to keep something that belongs to me? Margaret opened her mouth to argue but hesitated. There was no denying his point. It was hard to justify their actions when put so plainly. Still, she wasn't ready to admit defeat. Fine, she said finally, her tone clipped. What do you want? Money? A formal apology? Just reconnect the power, and we'll talk. John shook his head slowly. No deals. Not yet, anyway. First, you need to understand exactly how it feels to have something taken from you without permission. Maybe then we can have a real conversation. With that, he turned and walked back toward his house, leaving Margaret fuming in the darkness. The clubhouse remained powerless for the rest of the night, forcing the meeting to disband early. As frustrated murmurs spread among the attendees, John allowed himself a small smile. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he was finally being heard, even if it meant taking drastic measures to make it happen. By the next morning, news of John's bold move had spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. Everyone was talking about it, over coffee, during dog walks, and in hushed tones at the grocery store. Some residents were outraged, calling him reckless and immature for cutting off the power mid-meeting. What kind of person does that? One neighbor muttered loudly while waiting in line at the bakery. Others, however, couldn't help but admire his audacity. About time someone stood up to them, a man said with a smirk as he loaded groceries into his car. The divide in opinions only added fuel to the fire, turning what started as a private dispute into a full-blown community spectacle. Margaret, still fuming from the previous night's humiliation, decided she needed to handle this situation personally. She marched over to John's house early that afternoon, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Her usual composed demeanor was replaced by thinly veiled frustration as she knocked on his front door. When John answered, he didn't look surprised to see her. If anything, he seemed almost amused. "We need to talk," Margaret began without preamble, stepping past him into the living room. John closed the door behind her and leaned against the wall, arms crossed, ready for whatever lecture she had prepared. "This has gone far enough," she continued, her voice clipped. "You've made your point, John. Now reconnect the power so we can move forward." John raised an eyebrow. "And why should I do that? So you can go back to ignoring me like nothing happened." "That's not fair," Margaret snapped, throwing up her hands. "We offered alternatives. We tried to explain why the parking expansion is necessary. But instead of working with us, you've chosen to act like a child." "A child," John repeated, his tone sharp now. "I didn't hear alternatives. All I heard was your field doesn't matter because we say so. You took something that belongs to me without even asking. And now you're mad because I finally did something to get your attention." The room fell silent for a moment as both sides glared at each other. Finally, Margaret sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose as if trying to ward off a headache. "Look," she said more softly, "I'll admit things could have been handled better. Maybe we should have talked to you first. But the reality is, the parking issue isn't going away. People are frustrated, and we need solutions." John studied her for a long moment, weighing her words. He knew she wasn't wrong about the parking problem. It was causing tension in the neighborhood, but that didn't excuse what they'd done to his property. "Fine," he said eventually. "Here's my counteroffer. Remove the parking lines from my field immediately. Issue a formal apology, not just to me, but to the entire community, for taking private property without consent. and amend the HOA bylaws to ensure this never happens again to anyone else. Margaret blinked, clearly caught off guard by his specificity. "That's a lot to ask," she said hesitantly. "It's non-negotiable," John replied firmly. "If you want the power back on, those are my terms." For a few tense seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret nodded reluctantly. "All right. I'll bring it up at the next board meeting. But don't expect miracles overnight." John smiled faintly, though there was no warmth in it. "Oh, I'm not expecting miracles, just results." As Margaret left his house, John felt a flicker of hope, but also caution. He knew the fight wasn't over yet. Getting the HOA to agree to his demands wouldn't be easy, especially given their stubborn streak. Still, for the first time since the conflict began, he felt like he might actually have some leverage. Cutting the power had forced them to listen, and now it was up to them to prove they were willing to make things right. Over the next few days, whispers of John's ultimatum rippled through the neighborhood. Some residents applauded his boldness, while others grumbled about how unreasonable he was being. But regardless of where people stood, one thing was clear: John Harper had become impossible to ignore. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of tension, negotiation, and heated discussions. Margaret kept her word and brought John's demands to the next HOA board meeting, but it quickly became clear that not everyone was on board with giving in to his terms. Some members argued that apologizing publicly would set a dangerous precedent, while others insisted that amending the bylaws was unnecessary bureaucracy. "Why should we change rules for one person?" one board member complained, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous." Despite the pushback, Margaret found herself in an awkward position. The community was growing restless. Residents were tired of the ongoing drama, and many were starting to side with John. Online forums buzzed with debates, and even local news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a battle between property rights and community needs. With public pressure mounting, Margaret knew they couldn't afford to drag this out much longer. Reluctantly, she began working behind the scenes to rally enough support from the board to meet John's conditions. Finally, after what felt like endless back and forth, the HOA reached a fragile agreement. They agreed to remove the parking lines from John's field, though it required hiring a crew to repaint the area and restore it as close to its original state as possible. A formal apology letter was drafted, addressed not only to John but also to the entire neighborhood, acknowledging the mishandling of the situation and pledging to handle future disputes more fairly. Most importantly, the board voted to amend the HOA bylaws, requiring explicit written consent before any private property could be altered or reproposed for community use. When Margaret delivered the news to John, she did so with visible reluctance. Standing on his porch once again, she handed him a copy of the revised bylaws and the signed apology letter. "We've met your terms," she said stiffly. "Now, will you please reconnect the power?" John took the documents without saying a word, skimming through them carefully to ensure everything he'd asked for was included. Satisfied, he gave a small nod. "I'll take care of it tonight," he replied simply. True to his word, John reconnected the electrical line later that evening. By the time the sun set, the clubhouse lights flickered back on, signaling the end of the standoff. While some neighbors cheered at the resolution, others remained bitter, accusing John of holding the community hostage. But for John, none of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that his field, his sanctuary, was finally being returned to him. Over the next few weeks, crews worked tirelessly to erase the remnants of the parking lines. Slowly but surely, the scarred earth began to heal. Wildflowers started sprouting again, their vibrant colors peeking through the soil like stubborn reminders of resilience. John spent hours outside, tending to the land and coaxing it back to life. It wasn't perfect. The ground still bore faint traces of where the lines had been, but it was a start. Though relations between John and the HOA remained strained, something shifted in the way people viewed him. Neighbors who had once dismissed him as difficult or unreasonable now saw him as someone willing to stand up for himself when pushed too far. Some even approached him privately to express admiration for how he'd handled the situation. "You really showed them," one elderly woman said with a wink during a chance encounter at the mailbox. John chuckled softly, appreciating the gesture but knowing full well that respect came at a cost. Still, the experience left him wary. He no longer trusted the HOA to act in good faith, and he made a mental note to stay vigilant about protecting his property. But despite the lingering unease, he couldn't deny feeling a sense of quiet triumph. For the first time in months, he could look out at his field without anger bubbling beneath the surface. Instead, he felt pride, not just for standing his ground, but for proving that sometimes drastic actions are necessary to protect what matters most. As he stood on his porch one evening, watching the sunset bathe his field in golden light, John allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The fight had been exhausting, but it had also taught him something valuable. Boundaries exist for a reason, and defending them isn't selfish, it's essential. Months had passed since the chaos of the HOA conflict, and life in the neighborhood had settled into a quieter rhythm. The scars on John's field were nearly invisible now, with wildflowers reclaiming their rightful place and swaying gently in the breeze. It was as if the land itself had forgiven the intrusion, healing slowly but surely under John's care. For him, standing on his porch and looking out at the vibrant colors stretching toward the horizon felt like closure, a hard-earned reminder that some things are worth fighting for. But the experience had changed John. He wasn't the same man who had once avoided HOA meetings and kept to himself. The battle over his field had opened his eyes to the complexities of living in a community where individual rights often clashed with collective needs. While he still preferred solitude, he found himself paying closer attention to neighborhood discussions, especially when they involved changes that might impact others' properties. He even attended a few more meetings, not because he enjoyed them, but because he wanted to stay informed and ensure no one else faced what he had. The HOA, too, seemed different. Margaret continued leading the board, but her tone during meetings had softened slightly. She made an effort to involve homeowners in decisions rather than imposing solutions unilaterally. Amendments to the bylaws sparked conversations about transparency and fairness, prompting other residents to speak up about concerns they'd previously kept quiet. Some neighbors credited John's actions for sparking the shift, though Margaret would never admit it publicly. Still, not everyone viewed John as a hero. A handful of residents remained bitter, whispering behind his back about how dramatic or selfish he'd been. One evening, while walking his dog, John overheard two women chatting near the park. "He could have handled it better," one said sharply. "Did he really have to cut the power?" John smiled faintly to himself, but didn't engage. He knew he'd never win over everyone, and honestly, he didn't care. What mattered was that he'd stood up for what was right, even when it meant going against the grain. As time went on, John reflected on the lessons he'd learned from the ordeal. He realized that compromise wasn't always bad. If done fairly and respectfully, it could lead to solutions that benefited everyone. But he also understood that there were lines you simply couldn't cross without consequences. His field represented more than just land. It symbolized freedom, autonomy, and the importance of setting boundaries. Letting someone trample those principles without resistance only invited further disrespect. One crisp autumn afternoon, John hosted a small gathering in his backyard, inviting a few neighbors he'd grown closer to during the aftermath of the conflict. They sat around a bonfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories under a sky filled with stars. Someone brought up the infamous power-cutting incident, laughing about how dramatic it had been. John chuckled along, though he noticed Margaret wasn't among the guests. Maybe someday, he thought, they'd be able to move past their differences entirely. But for now, a cautious truce was enough. As the fire crackled and laughter echoed through the night, John felt a deep sense of gratitude for his home, for his field, and for the strength he'd discovered within himself. The fight had been messy, exhausting, and far from perfect, but it had taught him something invaluable. Peace doesn't mean avoiding conflict. It means knowing when to stand your ground and when to extend a hand. And as long as he had his sanctuary to retreat to, John knew he could face whatever challenges lay ahead.